Good morning, everybody. Friends, students, colleagues, thank you for joining us here today to launch the DC Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security. I am absolutely thrilled that we have such a high number of participants with over 300 people registered and joining us from countries as diverse as Mozambique, Ireland, and of course, the USA. My name is Dr. Shirley Graham, and I am the Director of the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs here at the Elliott School of International Affairs. I am absolutely delighted to be joined here today by the first woman, permanent dean of the Elliott School, Dr. Alyssa Ayres, the Gender Policy and Strategy Director at the US Institute of Peace, Dr. Kathleen Keenus, and the Honourable Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini, founder and CEO of ICAN and director of the London School of Economics Centre on Women, Peace and Security. You're all very welcome and thank you for joining us. We will also be joined this afternoon by 16 academics, practitioners and policy experts speaking on 4 thematic areas, and we're going to hear more about those shortly. And in our concluding event this afternoon, we're going to be joined by Ambassador Milan Verveer, Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, and Dr. Chantal de Jong-Udrat, President of Women in International Security. So we have an absolutely stellar lineup of experts on women, peace and security joining us here today. Before we get to our keynote speakers, I'd like to just remind us all of why we are here today. Why did we create this consortium, and what matters, and what is at stake if we don't create consortiums like this? Well, in the year 2000, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1325. As you all know, it was a landmark resolution highlighting the absence of women from formal peace processes and conflict resolution. It set out its 4 priorities under pillars that spoke to women's role in the prevention of conflict, women's participation in formal peace processes, and women's protection from violence, as well as women's inclusion in relief and recovery efforts. Now, as we all know as well, over the past 20 years, there have been great strides made, and 9 more resolutions have joined, which is now called the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. And the Women, Peace and Security Agenda acknowledges women's different experiences of conflict due to social and gender norms, which create gender inequalities and vulnerabilities. And therefore, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda centers the importance of women's leadership in preventing and responding to crisis and conflict. So, as I already mentioned, while important progress has been made, there is still much work to be done. In particular, there are key issue areas that are under-researched, under-implemented, and under-delivered, such as women's inclusion and meaningful participation in peace processes, improving women's economic security and access to resources, and of course, the protection of women human rights defenders and peace builders. For example, between the years 2015 and 19, 102 women human rights defenders, journalists, and trade unionists were killed. This happened in 26 conflict-affected countries, and we think that this is likely an undercount. The UN Secretary General cited misogynistic, sexist, hate speech by political leaders against women politicians and human rights defenders as one of the key triggers for the increase in violence against women. On International Women's Day last year, I had the incredible privilege of meeting the US State Department's 10 Women of Courage awardees. These are women who are bravely facing on a daily basis abuses and threats simply for standing up for human rights. One of these women, Zarifa Ghaffari, who is the first woman mayor in the deeply conservative Wardak province in Afghanistan, had her hands burnt by the Taliban as a warning. And since then, she has received many death threats. And at the end of last year, they murdered her father. I also met with Amaya Coppins, a 25-year-old Nicaraguan medical student who was imprisoned in horrific conditions for 11 months. Her crime? Leading peaceful marches, protesting the social welfare cuts and the destruction of indigenous lands. In the course of that movement, hundreds of people were killed. I also met with Dr. Rita Nyampinga from Zimbabwe. She was imprisoned for being a women's rights and workers' rights activist. In Zimbabwe, women are unable to inherit property, child marriage laws are not implemented, and same-sex relationships are criminalized. Journalists who speak out against the government and its laws are harassed and detained. None of these women should have experienced these harms. And each of these women were bravely standing up against oppressive regimes, which each of them have paid a heavy price for. We know that there is a strong correlation between gender inequality and the risk of conflict. Countries that are more gender equal are less likely to engage in civil wars, which often spill over borders into neighboring countries. Put simply, the more gender equal a country is, the more likely it is to be stable, secure, and prosperous. There is now an opportunity under the new Biden-Harris administration for the United States to become a gender superpower. Through the creation of the White House Gender Policy Council, launched yesterday, along with the Women, Peace and Security Act strategy and implementation plans, we have many of the necessary building blocks. But the question is, do we have the political will? To become a gender superpower, the US government would need to create a feminist foreign policy, one that adopts an expansive definition of gender, the empowerment of women and gender minorities, and the promotion of peaceful masculinities, both at home and abroad. These concepts and policies will each be explored and discussed in our workshops this afternoon, where we will be focusing on engaging men and boys on gender equality in foreign policy, LGBTQ+ understandings and perspectives of international security, intergenerational gender trauma and its historical context, and of course, feminist foreign policy. But now I would like to introduce our next speaker for today, and it is with great pleasure that I welcome the Elliott School Dean, Dr. Alyssa Ayres. And just a brief biography before Dr. Ayres speaks. So Dr. Ayres was appointed Dean of the Elliott School on February 1st this year. She is a foreign policy practitioner and award-winning author with senior experience in government, not-for-profit and private sectors. From 2013 to 21, she was Senior Fellow for India, Pakistan and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she remains an adjunct Senior Fellow. Her work focuses primarily on India's role in the world and on US relations with South Asia in the larger Indo-Pacific. Dr. Ayres served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia. During her tenure at the State Department in the Obama administration, she covered all issues across a dynamic region, including Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, and provided policy direction for 4 US embassies and 4 consulates. So with that, I would now like to hand over to Dr. Ayres. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Graham, and welcome everyone. My name is Alyssa Ayres, and I am the new Dean of the Elliott School. And in my 6th week here on the job, it is a particular delight to be able to welcome you all this morning for for the launch event of the DC Student Consortium on Women, Peace, and Security. We are particularly proud of the fact that the Elliott School, with Dr. Shirley Graham's entrepreneurial leadership, has spearheaded this initiative. So thank you, Dr. Graham, for your commitment to the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and for all the work of the Gender Equality Initiative and International Affairs program. We are further proud of the fact that the DC Student Consortium is creating space for connecting thought and practice by bringing together scholars, practitioners, and policymakers to discuss, innovate, and propose new ideas. As someone who trained as a scholar and then spent much of my career in more practice-focused work, this kind of space of interaction, bridging policy thought and action, is close to my heart. So thank you to the U.S. Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security for your support and your collaboration with our students and young professionals to develop the consortium and bring it to reality. I look forward to hearing what results from today's discussions. Now, this consortium is being driven by the commitment and energy of our students. I would like to commend and thank the student leadership team: Nick Swarovski, Noelle Cohen, Lady Londoño, Usmik Arutunyan, Madeline Elliott, Alice Shalander, Christina Renzetti, Alexis Eschleman, and Adriana Dameron. You are already leaders, and we look forward to seeing what innovative ideas you will advance in the field. Thank you as well to the 17 other universities in the DC Consortium, and especially to Georgetown, American, and the National Intelligence University for your close partnership on this initiative. We are so pleased to be working collectively with you to advance the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, and thank you for your collaboration. You all have a tremendous program ahead of you for today's launch. As you absorb and engage in conversation throughout the day, I'm certain your interactions will spark new ideas that can take us all forward. So this is a moment for us to celebrate the consortium's inauguration and truly look ahead to what comes next. So thank you all again for joining today, and my very best wishes. And let me now turn the proceedings back to Dr. Graham to get us all started.
Thank you so much, Dean Ayres. So I'm now going to hand over to two of those incredible student leaders that Dean Ayres just mentioned. President of the Student Consortium, Nicholas Swarovski, followed by Vice President of the Student Consortium, Noelle Cohen. I just want to commend them before we begin on their incredible energy and dynamism, and the way that they have inspired hundreds of other students to join this consortium and to really build out this fantastic student leadership team who've made today possible. So thank you. And Nick, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Graham. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the official all-day launch event of the DC Student Consortium on Women, Peace, and Security in honor of Women's History Month and International Women's Day. My name is Nick Swarovski. I am the president of the consortium, and I'm a second-year graduate student studying global gender policy and international affairs at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Before I begin, I'm going to share my screen really quickly, because I have a couple programs I'd like to thank. I would like to thank, let's go full screen, the various programs at the Elliott School that are co-sponsoring this event, which span a number of academic disciplines within the realm of international affairs. We're very grateful for the contributions and institutional grounding that the Elliott School has provided for the consortium and its work. And we're thrilled to see the academic community at Elliott come together and honor the importance of gender equality in international affairs. Now, as president, I'd like to take a second to share the origins of the consortium and how our initiative has progressed to the robust community that we've assembled today. The consortium began to take place back in the summer of 2020 under the strategic leadership of Dr. Shirley Graham in her capacity as a member of the Executive Committee of the U.S. Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security, convened by the U.S. Institute of Peace. In its strategic planning, the Civil Society Working Group wanted to further integrate with academic institutions in the DC area in its work to support the advancement of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and the effective implementation of the U.S. Women, Peace, and Security Act. Through her role as director of the Gender Equality Initiative in International Affairs at the Elliott School, last fall, Dr. Shirley Graham assembled a group of GW students interested in the gender security nexus to strategize the consortium's mission and vision. What started out as 9 GW students on a WebEx meeting has evolved into an organization spanning 5 academic institutions in DC, including Georgetown University, American University, the National Intelligence University, the University of the District of Columbia, and Northern Virginia Community College, connecting dozens of students, faculty, and staff. The consortium works towards 3 overarching goals. First, to encourage intergenerational and innovative thinking regarding the women, peace, and security agenda within the civil society space as it advocates for new research and policy. 2, to connect students working on women, peace, and security issues across the DC consortium while establishing meaningful coalitions between professionals and DC students. And 3, to increase awareness of the women, peace, and security agenda across a wider DC educational audience as it promotes a gendered approach to security and a feminist approach to foreign policy. We are particularly proud of our strategic partnership with the U.S. Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security, and we believe in the convening and analytical power of academia to develop policy research and papers that empower and enhance the mission of the working group. We believe that gender equality must always be central to peace and security because the evidence shows that gender equality makes us more prosperous, more secure, and more resilient to complex challenges. The policy workshops that you all will attend this afternoon represent 4 issue areas that can expand the intersectionality and relevance of the women, peace, and security agenda as it relates to security and peace building. These issue areas include incorporating LGBTQ+ and queer voices and experience into the women, peace, and security agenda, defining how we can engage men and boys in gender equality in a way that is responsible and accountable to women's leadership, operationalizing and implementing a feminist foreign policy, and addressing intergenerational gender trauma in its historical context. We are so excited for the dynamic and enlightening conversations that will take place today, and we're ready to roll up our sleeves and turn those conversations into policy ideas following the event. I'll now turn to my colleague Noelle Cohen to discuss the long-term goals of the consortium following this launch event. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Nick. Thank you all for coming to our launch event. My name is Noelle Cohen, and I am the Vice President of the consortium, as well as a first-year graduate student studying international affairs with concentrations in gender and security at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Echoing Nick's remarks, the consortium is very proud of its strategic partnership with the Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security. With that in mind, I would like to take the time now to thank Dr. Shirley Graham of GIA, Dr. Chantelji Joan-Udrat of WISE, and Megan Corrado, Chair of the CSWG, as well as all of the members of the working group who have supported the creation of our organization. We are looking forward to partnering with the working group in order to promote our goals and serve as a way students can contribute to research and support all the amazing work the members of the group are doing. During today's events, we will have 4 workshops examining several aspects of the WPS agenda. These topics discussed in today's launch event will serve as the subjects of our first policy briefs. In each of the briefs produced, students of the consortium will include the expertise of invited panelists and the questions asked by attendees to produce thoughtful policy examinations. These 4 policy briefs will serve as our first official contribution to the working group. However, the work of the organization does not end there. Our hope is to see the consortium serve as a community focused in fostering interest and awareness of the WPS agenda. As Nick mentioned in his opening remarks, George Washington was the first university to create a consortium chapter. However, in the last month, 2 new chapters have been created at Georgetown University and the National Intelligence University. And as the consortium expands, we've created new ways to engage our ever-growing community. Earlier this month, we launched our inaugural newsletter, detailing events and research happening across our community. We hope to use this newsletter as a way to support the amazing work happening across all member universities through highlighting students, faculty, and new opportunities to engage with the WPS agenda. In addition to the newsletter, we will continue to host all consortium monthly meetings where all our members throughout the DC community can connect. In doing these things, we hope to see the consortium continue to grow and become a long-lasting institution that outlives our graduate student years. Our group has the potential to become a place where those of us interested in women, peace, and security can advance professionally, as well as find mentors and cultivate friendships. For those of you in attendance today, we look forward to including you and your peers in the consortium as we create this community of students, academics, and practitioners interested in incorporating a gendered lens in the understanding of international security. With that said, I would like to thank several members of the community who were integral in the creation of our organization and today's launch event. First is Alice Shylander, our Director of Social Media. Alice, you can pop up on the screen now. And the second is Lady Londono, our Director of Programming and Events. And last but not least, I would like to thank all of the members of the GW leadership team and of the planning committee who have worked so hard to create this amazing event. I've listed all of their names on a slide that I will be sharing with you momentarily. Thank you guys again so much for all the help you have given us in the creation of this group and this launch event. We couldn't have done it without you. And again, thank you for joining us in our launch event. It is now my pleasure to give the floor back to Nick, who can introduce our amazing keynote speakers.
Thank you very much, Noelle. It is now my honor to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Kathleen Kuehnast. In the interest of time, I will not read out the full bios of our keynote speakers, but we will include them in the chat for everyone's reference. Dr. Keenus is the Director of Gender Policy and Strategy at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she has worked since 2008. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Keenus is a leading voice on the gendered impacts of violence and conflict in men and women, especially concerning the critical role women should play in peace building and the engaging of men in conflict countries and the championing of women's rights. Dr. Keenus brings 15 years of experience in international development, primarily with the World Bank, as a senior social scientist researching thematic streams of women in poverty, social capital, and community-driven development in fragile and post-conflict societies. Dr. Keenus is a recipient of the postdoctorate Mellon Foreign Fellowship at the Library of Congress, and also a former postdoctorate Kennan Institute Fellow at the Wilson Center. Dr. Keenus is the 2015 recipient of the Brigida Huston Human Rights Award of the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. She holds a doctorate in sociocultural anthropology from the University of Minnesota. Without further ado, Dr. Kathleen Kuehnast.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks everyone for being a part of this really amazing launch today. I want to thank Dean Ayers, Dr. Graham, and the group of you. Such an excellent slide, Noelle, to just really see what it takes to make a community of practice. So thank you for inviting me. And on behalf of the U.S. Institute of Peace and the U.S. Civil Society Working Group, of which USIP is the secretariat, we want to congratulate you on all of this action that you have undertaken in just months to make the DC Student Consortium. Youth really does make a qualitative difference and is helping to push us to a new understanding of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. It was over 25 years ago when another civil society group brought evidence, voice, and vision to the UN and other multilateral institutions, saying we need not only the voice of civil society, but we need top-down power to move the needle on the very stalled understanding that women are both victims and casualties of war, and their lives must be counted also critically, so that they must be a significant part of peace processes. Despite all of the efforts with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, women do remain undervalued in peace building, seriously underrepresented in peace processes, even though we know they've always been an integral part of war and peace, and yet they remain invisible. I would just like to note with this DC Student Consortium, what we're really up against. I mean, gender is an invisible yet organizing force in all of our lives every day. We accept it without question. It is like the air we breathe. Sometimes we use the term gender to mean another name for women. But it is important to embrace the social science definition of the word gender, which is the expression of how a society organizes its expectations, norms, and values for both men and boys, women and girls, and sexual and gender minorities through its social institutions, its laws, its religious institutions, and familial processes. And so when we say that gender is not another name for women, we know that to actually change the gender equation, we need to include man and gender differences and sexual differences to change and challenge the narrowly defined notions of gender roles for all of us. According to geneticists, we all begin in a genderless state. Out of all of the pairs of chromosomes, it's only the very last pair that differentiates us as biological male or female. This is important because it helps demonstrate how malleable gender roles are in human society, even though they are difficult to alter and change because of social and legal institutions. We came to this realization when a decade ago, in a small conference room in the National Restaurant Association off M Street, we gathered 20 representatives of countries that had already committed to the creation of what was called a National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. Throughout that day, we laid out evidence as to why the US government should consider such an action moving forward. Our voices came together to support the government's efforts with lending the firsthand experience of civil society actors, many who will join you today. They had firsthand experience in war ravaged countries to not only lend a sense of urgency to the issue, but a vision that we can do much better in our foreign policy when women are a part of the solution. Well, WPS has come a long way since that day in July. We've had several US national action plans. We have now an Act on Women, Peace, and Security that was passed in 2017. And so even as we have a stronger top-down position, if you will, and a powerful agenda, WPS still cannot be actualized without civil society. Just adding women is not enough. Just adding resolutions is not enough. Having a new community of practice like the DC Student Consortium adds energy, vision, and perspective to our future. It is a community of practice that totally requires diversity, equity, and inclusion. Otherwise, 1325 and its 9 resolutions can become its own ivory tower of sorts. I would also say WPS needs a serious gender analysis because it is not yet inclusive. That is, including people with gender and sexual differences, people of color, and people with unique perspectives on the experience of war. Without that, it will not continue to succeed. We're heartened by the fact that UNSCR 1325 has been translated into more than 100 languages. But despite this growing work, we remain concerned that the challenges we need in terms of the investment, and when I say investment, I don't mean just human resources, but we need funding that focuses on preventions, the impacts on peace processes themselves, justice for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, and so much more. So how Consortium help us uncover the answers to some very tough questions now that you are part of our Why after 20 years do we still see so little progress? How can we expand out of this niche field? My last hope for you as a new consortium is that let's lay the groundwork for integrating gender analysis in all academic disciplines. It is not enough that it has its own unique study. We have to demonstrate that a feminist view allows for more inclusive decisions. I want to add just an example to round out my hope for you all. When I first began at the World Bank years ago, I was asked to be a part of a very interesting study to look at gender analysis in the transportation sector. If any of you know anything about transportation, there's a lot of economists and a lot of engineers, and usually no social development experts. That has changed a lot over the years. But one of the things we did was try to actually demonstrate if you build highways that are only concerned about getting goods from point A to point B, you can't really appreciate all the invisible networks of women who journey long distances to find safe crossing across that highway to take children to school or to go to work. We were able to demonstrate and provide evidence that it added sometimes over an hour to their commute because a big highway had been laid in between their two communities. To their credit, the engineers were excited by this new mapping of roads that benefited more people, especially women and children. So again, I hope I lay out another idea for your fantastic consortium to bring gender analysis into all academic disciplines. I can't think of a better community of practice to get this message across, so that whether it is in medicine, engineering, architecture, you name it, we have gender analysis integrated. That will help us move the needle with dealing with women, peace, and security in foreign policy as well. Just in conclusion, and as Nick might have mentioned, I'm a trained anthropologist and probably trained more in the applied anthropology of the Margaret Meads of the world, who once said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." And so today on your launch, we look to you to help change our world, and we'll be here all along the way as eventually the baton is passed to your generation. We look forward to working with you and having you as a part of the US Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security. Again, congratulations, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keenus, for those very kind, very moving remarks. Let's please all give a virtual round of applause for Dr. Keenus. I'm taking to the bank invisible organizing force in the air we breathe every time I talk about gender. So thank you for that. I would now like to welcome the final keynote speaker of our opening plenary session, Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini. As the founder and executive director of ICAN, Ms. Anderlini has over 2 decades of experience as a peace strategist, working globally on conflicts, crises, and violent extremism with a mix of civil society, governments, and the United Nations. At ICAN, she spearheads the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, comprising independent women-led organizations active in 40 countries globally, preventing violence and promoting peace, rights, and pluralism. In 2000, she was a civil society leader and drafter of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. Her current appointments include serving as the steering board of the UK's National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, the Commonwealth's Panel of Experts on Countering Violent Extremism, UNDP's Civil Society Advisory Council, and as adjunct professor at Columbia University. She was the 2014 recipient of the UN Association Perdita Huston Award for Human Rights and the 2016 Greeley Peace Scholar at the University of Massachusetts. In December 2019, Ms. Anderlini received the Member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire Award in recognition for her work and for services to international peace building and women's rights. She holds a master's in philosophy and social anthropology from Cambridge University. It is my privilege to introduce Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I feel incredibly old, but it's lovely to be here. And I'm going to start with a little piece of writing for about a minute. The negotiations leading to peace are never simple. They're wrapped in history and identity and the struggle for power and the quest for justice and personal loss, grief, and uncertainty. In contemporary civil wars and internal conflicts where violence reaches into homes and villages, sometimes pitting neighbors against each other, peace cannot be imposed from above. Yet from Dayton to Rambouillet, Arusha to Colombia, it's predominantly male leaders of the fighting parties who are negotiating an end to war and laying the foundations for peace. The justification often given is that the peace table must bring together those who've taken up arms because it's up to them to stop the conflict. While this argument may hold true for negotiations to secure an end to hostilities, it cannot be sustained for the discussions that build the framework for a new society. The process of reconstructing a society emerging from war requires the equal contributions of men and women, and ensuring women's equal participation in such negotiations enhances the legitimacy of the process by making them more democratic and responsive to the priorities of all the sectors of the affected population. The burden of peacemaking and peace building is shared by all members of society. I wrote that in 1999 when I was pretty much closer to most of you in age than I am to myself right now. And I wanted to share that with you because as the title of the talk is Reconstructing or Reframing Women and Peace Building, I wanted to actually kind of emphasize the point that we are living in a 20-year cycle of a Groundhog Day. 20 years ago, this time, we were all concerned about what was going to happen in Afghanistan and with the Taliban and with the situation of women. Today, that issue is even more urgent. And yet we're having the same arguments. Women are being excluded. The US envoy, Mr. Khalilzad, is trying to sort of hash together a deal, and Afghan women are literally being killed day in, day out because of their activism, whether it's because they're peace activists, human rights defenders, judges, journalists, anything in the public space, they're being attacked. So we're living in this kind of Groundhog Day, and this insanity isn't just about Afghanistan. You know, Einstein talked about doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. It's the same with Palestine and Israel. It's the same with the Iran process. We keep doing the same things, and it is for those of you going into politics and diplomacy, please remember this, that any other profession, if you make mistakes, you try and fix them or you try and find solutions, and successes are built upon. In our world right now, we seem to repeat bad practices and shy away from successes and actually places where things have worked when we're thinking about the kinds of changes that we need to see in our peace processes. So that's kind of a sobering, I hope, provocative starting point. And I want to explain this in terms of where it fits in with what we're trying to do around the question of why we talk about women's participation and the importance. And I'm going to hone in specifically around peace processes because this is the most exclusive, exclusionary space out there. The reason why we went to Security Council 20 years ago was because it was a space where women were excluded from anything to do with women's rights, development issues, a human security lens was perceived as unrelated to the Security Council. So we actually wanted to shift the paradigm on that. And here are the sort of underlying factors when we think about the design of ongoing peace processes. Number one, there's an assumption that these are rational processes, that we're bringing people together, that these are interest-based talks, and they're going to sit there, and once we figure out shared interests, we can move forward and find a solution. This is a myth. If you look at any of the peace processes, whether they're the wars that have gone on for 20 years, or frankly, the 40-year dispute that we have between Iran and the US, you'll see that at the core of it, we have emotionality, we have psychological issues, we have fear, we have fear of humiliation and existentialism that cuts across what's happening. In the case of Iran, for example, one thing that is never discussed is why are we not asking the Iranian regime for an apology for the hostage taking in 1979? That hostage taking that took 444 days underlies a lot of the gut visceral reaction against Iran that has shaped how we perceive the Iranian state right now, 40 years later, despite all the changes that have happened. Yet we as Americans, or Americans in this country, or our politicians and our diplomats, when you say ask for an apology, they almost bristle, as if it's like, we don't need an apology, it doesn't matter. It's been painful. Let's ask for an apology. Let's think about negotiations from the standpoint of emotions and rationality. And we can have other examples of this. Second thing, there's an assumption that when we have negotiations, people are coming to the table, if you take the Yemen process or Colombia or Afghanistan elsewhere, that at some point there's going to be a stalemate because neither side is winning. We always assume that there are only two sides, first of all. Secondly, that they'll come to the table when they are hurting, i.e. that there is a cost to either side for continuing the war and neither side can win. But the truth of the matter is, in the wars that we see today, the people that are benefiting from the war, the people that are waging the wars, if you look at the Yemeni government officials sitting in very comfortable hotels in Riyadh, or if you think about the various forces that are behind the armed actors in Syria, in Yemen, etc., in Sudan, elsewhere, they are not hurting. They don't have their kids on the ground. They don't even have assets on the ground. They don't have any of their resources on the ground. Most of the time, many of them actually are sitting abroad, or they have passports in their pockets, which means that they can leave. Their kids aren't there. They're not hurting. The people that are hurting are civilians, overwhelmingly young people now, because so much of the world's population is now young. And they're literally becoming the fodder for the sort of warring parties and those who benefit from conflict. So we have to challenge our own assumptions about why people may want to come to peace talks, or what the incentives are, and who else is missing. And the third thing wrapped in all of this is that elite bargains is the way to go, right? We have to bang heads together and the elite matter. And that's why we keep creating these kind of two-party football style peace talks, where it's one side and then we try and shove all the opposition in the other side and exclude everybody else and keep saying, oh, well, if the women come, it's going to rock the boat. This, again, is a complete fallacy. It's a myth. All of our researchers has shown this, qualitative and quantitatively. We've shown that this is actually false. Not only that, we know from the World Bank that over 50% of peace processes or peace agreements fail within the first 5 to 10 years, and that literally 100% of the peace agreements that have been signed have not been implemented fully. So there's elements of implementation that happen, but the ones that are most implemented are the ones where you've had women in civil society and women peace builders, et cetera, actively engaged in the process. So elite bargains, which is the norm, doesn't work either, right? And yet we keep repeating the same patterns. Where do women, or why is it that I've spent 20 years banging my head against various brick walls and trying to sort of get the change in paradigm around widening the peace table? It's because the nature of the wars that we see have changed. So it's a much more complicated landscape on the ground. There's a democratization of violence in terms of the perpetrators of violence, in terms of the actors of violence. But there's also a sort of flowering, if you want, or a sort of again, kind of an increased number of peace actors. When a conflict happens, when a crisis happens on the ground within a country, people run to solve it. And it can be war, it can be COVID, frankly. It's local people run to address the problem. What we've seen over and over again is that it is often women who are the first people to be the first responders. And it is particularly women who take on a peace building lens that engage in wanting to talk to armed actors. It's dangerous work, but it's a particular cohort of people. And in the research that I've done over the last 20 years, including last year when we published Recognizing Women Peace Builders as a new document and a new piece of research, we wanted to articulate the importance of recognizing that it's not all women. It's not generically kind of assuming that, oh, if we put women in the delegations of parties, that all women are inherently peaceful and so forth. Absolutely not. We've seen that in this country, right? It's really about recognizing those people who emerge and who define themselves with an approach of saying, we want to go and talk. We want to try and mitigate this violence, and we're going to put ourselves at risk. So how we think about them is an important piece. And what I've seen over and over again is that we have, on the one hand, from the highest levels of our governments down to the lowest levels at the community level, those who have power have abrogated responsibility. Those who have the power and the response and should have the responsibility to protect civilians have given that up and in fact are attacking civilians. And those with the least power, the women in my network and the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership and other peace builders around the world are taking on that burden of responsibility. They're not doing it with violence, they're doing it with dialogue. They're doing it with engaging on a humanitarian space. They're doing it with mediation and psychosocial support and being interlocutors between state and communities and so forth. So we need to recognize that they are critical actors and that they deserve to be at the tables of negotiation, not shoved into somebody else's political agenda, not as window dressing, but as their own political voice and agency, because when they come forward, they are representing the voice and the concerns and the vision and the aspirations of their communities and people who are literally the fodder of these wars. So that shift needs to happen, and we need to rethink, if you want, the responsibility to protect agenda, taking away its militarism and actually thinking about it in terms of the local actors on the ground. Second thing is that our concepts of peace, now whether you call it feminist, whether you call it from the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, depending on where you are, some of these terms are loaded, so I don't want to get into the labeling, but I want to focus on how we define peace and what a peace process is. If we start with the idea that a peace process is just a power sharing deal or something that we want to sort of manage the conflict, take the war away from violence and into a political space and manage it and let it kind of leave it to themselves, if you want. If that's our notion of what a peace process is, you'd go in one direction. If, on the other hand, you're actually talking to people on the ground who are living with the war and see the peace process as a time and a moment in their country's history where they can reimagine the future and have a transformed relationship between adversaries and between voices and communities that have been marginalized, then you design a different type of peace process. You bring those voices in. And the beauty of it is that in the last 20 years, we have had good examples of inclusive processes where women have been included, where young people have been included, where tribes and religious groups and others have been included. We had that in the Yemen National Dialogue. We had an iteration of it that was evolved in the Colombia peace process, where the voices of victims and survivors was brought into the talks. We have good practices, and yet we continue to repeat the bad ones. And this is where, for me, we need to rethink and bring it back to where you all sit as students going into this space. So a couple of things to address. Number one, last year we launched, from ICAN, we launched the She Builds Peace campaign and call to action that had pillars of recognizing and ensuring the representation of women peace builders at peace talks for the reasons that I just mentioned, financing their local work in an equitable way so that they can get on and do the good work that others are unable or unwilling to do. And thirdly, protecting them, because right now, in the last few years, we've seen that the work of peace builders and peace building itself is being targeted by governments, by militias, et cetera, et cetera. So they need to be protected and enabled to just carry on and be able to live in their countries and do that. We launched this campaign. It comes from women on the ground. The recommendations that we have put together in our reports, and I hope they'll be available to you, come with deep consultation with women on the ground and with governments and other key stakeholders. It's really important that we value and recognize the intellectual leadership, not just the strategic, intellectual, and tactical leadership of women on the ground doing this work. It is often women of color. It is often women who are not coming from elite academic backgrounds. Sometimes they are and sometimes they're not, but often they're not. they are doing this work based on their lived experiences. I'm an anthropologist as well, and I think it's really important that we value and understand that that power and influence and so forth doesn't just come with a degree or with a title. It comes in other sorts of ways. So the intellectual leadership of women is critical. And as we look to our governments, whether we have it, the WPS Act or national action plans or other things, it's important. And I really want, again, the next generation coming through to watch the lessons that we sometimes, my generation, we came across in a hard way. Be careful that there isn't intellectual appropriation. Be careful that they don't take the book and keep the cover but gouge out the substance. The substance is coming from people on the ground, and it's essential that we keep it, because that's where we're going to see the change. Second point, gender analysis. Kathleen mentioned earlier, I would agree with you. Again, I've spent a lot of time talking about and doing work around the gender dimensions of natural resource management, the gender dimensions of ceasefire negotiations, all of these things. Gender is present everywhere, and all you have to do is have the lens or the glasses on, and all of a sudden the world looks different. We need gender analysis to be a core course in any undergrad or graduate program on development, international relations, any of the sectors, defense, security, etc. It's essential that people have that going into other aspects of their work. So call for that, ask for that. I hope we get it, and it's certainly something that I've been advocating and trying to teach where I get to teach. Thirdly, documenting the cases, and this is about research, documenting the cases in partnership with the people that are doing the work. So often we get academia going in and being able to get their PhDs or master's degrees and so forth based on the work of others. But let's co-author. Let's make sure that the women and the young people on the ground in these countries that are doing this work, pioneering strategies and concepts and so forth, are themselves the authors and recognized scholars of their own practices. So creating more equity in that space is important, and actually bringing those case studies out. And related to that is, let's not assume that culture and tradition and religion are kind of adversarial to what we're saying, that they are regressive forces, and what we say from the outside world, laws and norms and so forth, are the progressive forces. No, what we see over and over again is that women are harnessing the best part of their faith, the best part of their superstitions and traditions and social norms where they have influence. The best part, the most important, powerful elements of motherhood. You know, motherhood and apple pie is one thing. Motherhood telling young men don't fight is a whole other story, right? And it's important because if we don't use it, extremist negative forces are. And this is something that we're seeing, that Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and the Taliban actually tap into women's social roles and influences. So let's not think that this is just a nice thing for the ladies. This is actually really important things around the concepts of power and influence. And then finally, expanding our definitions of peace. As I mentioned, the definition of peace in terms of making it more holistic, but also assumptions around power. Power is seen as such a finite, binary kind of concept. I have it, you don't. Whereas if you actually look at it from the standpoint of where the Women, Peace and Security and Women Peace Builders look at it, what I see over and over again, that it's a little bit like saying, well, why can't power be like love? Why can't we all be powerful in different ways? Why can't we, let the tide raise all boats together and have a shared understanding of the future that we want? So bringing that into our global spaces and all the way down and into our local spaces, I think is critical, including in this country. So there are different ways in which this agenda can help us think through what's happening. And I'm going to end with this. Where do you come into this mix? Your voices as the younger generation coming through, as people affiliated with universities, as I said, the research piece is important, but as your voices as citizens in this country, as citizens in whatever country you may come from and you're returning to, this is really, your voice matters a lot. Today, if we had a massive national campaign asking our government to make sure that Afghan women are at the peace tables, at the negotiations that may be taking place in Turkey or wherever they may be happening, if we had that pressure coming from the states upwards into Congress, demanding implementation of the WPS Act, demanding accountability for Ambassador Khalilzad and so forth, I guarantee you there would be a difference in how this agenda is moving forward. I don't like to say this, but I'm quoting Steve Bannon here. politics is downstream from culture. We need to shift our own cultural space and understanding of the power that we have to shape our foreign policies and our engagement with the world. And having a consortium like this, I think, is the beginning, is the foundation stepstones of that. Because if we can reach out across the country to universities and students around across all the states, actually, and have a collective voice demanding a shift and demanding democratization of our national security, demanding accountability for the laws that we already have, I think that the paradigm would shift and we would see these more inclusive processes happening. So thank you for starting this consortium. Really looking forward to working with you all, and hope that the rest of the day goes well, and good luck. Thank you.
Sanam, thank you so much for those really powerful and important remarks. And thank you also, Kathleen, for your remarks. There is much for us to think about there. And I think crucially, this call to action in relation to women at the peace table in Afghanistan and what we need to do as a collective and as a community to ensure that their voices, their experiences are heard. I really valued what you both said in relation to the overwhelming exclusion still of women in formal peace processes, and yet we know that women are leaders in the informal grassroots processes that happen all across the world in terms of peace building. And I also really value your remarks in terms of what this consortium can achieve in terms of its own research and its own leadership role, and how we can work together across and within our various institutions. So thank you both for your remarks, and we hugely appreciate them. And I think this has been a very fitting launch of our DC Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security today. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Vice President of the Consortium, Noelle Cohen, who's just going to follow up with some remarks about our program this afternoon and how you can stay in contact with the consortium.
Thank you, Dr. Graham, and thank you, Dean Ayres, Dr. Keenust, and Ms. Anderlini for your wonderful opening remarks. Just a quick note, Alice included the link in the chat to the ICAN She Builds Peace campaign framework, which Ms. Anderlini mentioned in her remarks, so please be sure to check that out. And just to serve as a reminder, we have our 4 policy workshops starting later today at 12 p.m. Following those parallel workshops, we will conclude today's events at 5 p.m. with a plenary session featuring Ambassador Melian Verveer, the first U.S. Ambassador for Women's Global Issues, and Dr. Chantal Dijon-Udrat, President of Women in International Security. We look forward to seeing you all during today's sessions. Be sure to follow us on social media throughout today. We have listed our social media account handles on the screen. Alice should be sharing that with you all. And we look forward to seeing you all participate later. Again, thank you for participating in our opening session, and have a great rest of your day. Oh, but just as a quick reminder, if anyone has any questions, we're going to open up the chat, and Dr. Graham, Nick, and I will stay online to answer any questions you guys may have. So again, thank you.